Well, Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay, there is a point beyond which they must not advance.
Nuclear annihilation. This threatened the world throughout the Cold War. Near the end of the Second World War, the United States of America had developed the most powerful weapon that mankind had ever seen, the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union was not far behind in development. The Cold War was largely a result of political disagreement between two former allies after the events of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union. The primary reasons for the start of the Cold War were different ideologies in forming social systems, the desire to be a dominant political and economical power, and to have the most powerful military in the world.
When I was in undergraduate school, I was taught that the United States was most responsible for the Cold War. As time went on, most historians sort of believe today that there was mutual responsibility on both sides. So there were things that the United States did to bring it on, and there were things that the Soviet Union did to bring it on.
America's first successful hydrogen bomb test showed how destructive the nuclear weapons could be.
12 августа 1953 года. Испытание первой в мире водородной бомбы мощностью взрыва в 20 раз больше, чем взрыв атомной бомбы.
America had fought against communism at home and abroad. While the conflicts abroad may have been violent, the fight at home wasn't very pretty either. Beginning in the early 50s and all throughout the mid-60s, a nationwide panic called the Red Scare started to emerge. This was the idea that communism was going to take over the U.S. This was a genuine fear for most, and arguably one man single-handedly changed the social norms of the 50s and the 60s. He was a Wisconsin senator by the name of Joseph P. McCarthy. If his name doesn't ring a bell, then he was the one who developed McCarthyism.
The Cold War began a feeling in the United States of what we called McCarthyism. Now, McCarthy didn't begin his tirade until 1951, but the fear of communism was there long before that, and it particularly took off after the Cold War began.
McCarthyism was a political attitude that if somebody did anything or said anything that was in the slightest bit communist, they were to be shunned by society and, in some extreme cases, arrested or even deported.
Made it difficult. Well, there were people in Hollywood who were blacklisted, who couldn't get jobs because at one time they had been members of the Communist Party or had been sympathetic to the Communist Party. People were careful about what magazines they got. If somebody noticed that they got a particular magazine that might be left-wing, you could lose a job because of that. The government began a loyalty security program and went through the backgrounds of thousands of government employees to see if there were any communists or communist supporters in government. But
this made a certain silent period throughout the 50s and early 60s. McCarthyism was essentially a second witch hunt, with many false accusations of people being supposedly communist. just to destroy credibility of government officials or even civil rights leaders. The hypocrisy in it all is that the American CIA took Cuban exiles who came from a communist country and trained them to overthrow their new dictator. Beginning of August 29th, 1949, the Soviet Union had their first successful nuclear detonation in 1953. This gave them the power to stand with America and even against them. The United States and the Soviet Union both wanted to be the most powerful nation in the world and had to build up arms to compete with each other when in fact America was always ahead. Even in Berlin, Germany, there was turmoil over communism. America, France, England, and the Soviet Union were all governing Germany to make sure a second Hitler did not come to power. After the infrastructure in Germany had been rebuilt to be a democracy, Germany was to begin free elections. However, in 1948, when the US, England, and France had left, the Soviet Union had stayed and kept the eastern side of Germany and led it under a dictatorship. Soon after, a wall known as the Berlin Wall was built by the Soviet Union, thus cutting Germany in half. Citizens could not cross, and if one were crossing as a politician or for diplomatic purposes, you were required to have an interzone passport to pass from the democratic side, the west, and the communist side, the east. The wall, however, was taken down in a later date. Eventually, President Kennedy went to Berlin to give a speech to the people of the east side of the wall.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The treasonous act of the Soviet Union imposing communism after saying that they would allow free elections led many Western European countries, Canada, and the US to join and sign the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, aka NATO, to prevent the Soviet Union from spreading communism to other countries. While ironically on the other side, the Soviets had the Warsaw Pact, which included many Eastern European countries such as Poland and of course the Soviet Union. This, however, was not the only example of a country going into turmoil due to communism. June 1950, the first military action of the Cold War began when the Soviet-backed North Korean People's Army invaded its neighbor to the south. The United States thought that they must intervene because of the Truman Doctrine, and that it might start a Soviet plot to take over the world. At first, the conflict was a defensive one. It was to get the communists out of South Korea, and it went badly for the Allies. The United States switched to an offensive to try and push the communists out of South Korea, and would have done it all the way had China not intervened. In 1959, Fidel Castro came to power overthrowing President Batista, who was very American-friendly. Almost as soon as he came to power, Castro took steps to reduce American influence on the island. He nationalized American-dominated industries such as sugar and mining. Cuba quickly set up relations with the Soviet Union, and America responded by setting a prohibition on Cuban sugar. There were many exiles of Cuba because of this political instability in the country at the time. The Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, decided to train these exiles in order to hopefully overthrow the new communist leader, Fidel Castro. The CIA assumed that he was very unpopular with the people due to the fact that he was communist, and thought that they could use this against him.
The assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro.
The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
Cuando las tropas surafricanas avanzaban a 70 kilómetros por día.
It just so happened that Fidel was very popular in Cuba. On April 17th, 1961, the CIA sent to train exiles to the Bay of Pigs to fight and take down Castro. The plan failed almost immediately. We only trained them and gave them weapons, but did not actually have American troops to fight with them, nor did we even provide air support in which the exiles expected. Coral reefs sank ships, paratroopers landed in the wrong place, and the fighting was over in less than a day. 114 exiles were killed and over 1,100 were taken prisoner. In 1962, possibly one of the most significant parts of the Cold War happened, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And then we came back to Mayport, Florida, and the Cuban crisis broke out.
After Castro coming into power in 1959, the United States made a trade embargo with the new communist country. This severely affected Cuba's economy. The Soviet Union saw this as an opportunity to help fellow communists and place missiles near their enemy for a primary strike position. The United States discovered the missiles the Soviets had secretly placed in Cuba, which had the range and power to destroy several major American cities. The United States acted quickly, thinking of several different strategies and options, and settled on making a naval quarantine around Cuba in order to prevent any more Soviet ships from coming. Little did we know there were already missiles in Cuba. In the end, the Soviet Union turned back at the blockade after a 13-day standoff. Both the Soviet Union and the United States realized how close we were to destroying everything and backed off. Kennedy made some deals with Khrushchev, and the Soviet Union took their nuclear missiles back from Cuba, and America eventually took theirs back from Turkey.
And one Monday morning, we was going out like we always do, chasing aircraft carriers, following them for safety. And the captain came over the PA system and says, "We are now on our way to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba." And then the next morning, we were about halfway to Cuba. He says, "We're going to have a blockade. The Russians are trying to bring some missiles into Cuba, and we're being sent down there to stop them." And so we did.
In 1989, Polish voters elected a non-communist opposition in their legislature. Everyone was soon expecting Soviet tanks to roll into Poland to prevent the government from taking power. But Gorbachev refused to act. Soon, Eastern European communist dictatorships started falling one by one. The Union of Treaty was proposed by Gorbachev in 1991, giving much greater autonomy to the Soviet republics while keeping them under central command. Demands for freedom started to expand as the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia declared independence. On Christmas Day, Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife were executed on live television.
I like to believe that there are events in history that can be prevented, but I think that on the United States' side, its distrust of communism and its long distrust of the Soviet Union, we didn't even have diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union until 1933, that this distrust of communism in the Soviet Union made it very difficult to cooperate.
Though the Cold War was over, not many people had gotten used to the feeling yet. From the 1940s through the early 1990s, Americans were born into it. It was a part of their culture that was influenced by the fear of communism.